and I'll say a little bit about what Stoicism is, because there might be people here that don't know as much about the subject. And then I'll talk about the relationship between Stoicism and psychotherapy. And what I really want to get into are some practical techniques from Stoicism that help people to cope with stress, and that might be particularly relevant during the time of pandemic. That's something that people are asking a lot about. So I'm a cognitive behavioral psychotherapist. I'm one of the founding members of the Modern Stoicism organization, which started in 2012. Massimo's also involved with it. It was founded by Professor Christopher Gill from Exeter University in England. And we have a multidisciplinary team of volunteers who organize Stoicon and various online courses about Stoicism, including Stoic Week, and one that I'm going to be talking about today, which is Stoic Mindfulness and Resilience Training, which is a big online course we have running at the moment with over 5,000 participants, which we use to gather research data on Stoicism and its benefits for coping with stress and building emotional resilience. So that's a little bit about me and my involvement with Stoicism. And what is Stoicism? I'll say very briefly for those of you who are maybe kind of newish to the subject, because we've probably got a bit of a mixed audience. So Stoicism is an ancient Greek school of philosophy that was founded in 301 BC in Athens by Zeno of Citium. And it was very much influenced by earlier philosophies, particularly the teachings of Socrates. And the central doctrine of Stoicism is this idea, it's a moral, an ethical doctrine. It says that virtue is the only true good, arete is the only true good. It's a word I actually prefer sometimes to translate as moral wisdom. And hopefully I'll get a chance to kind of explain the reasons for that later. So virtue is the only true good is the central teaching of Stoicism. And the main implication of that is that everything else, like all the things that people typically value in life, like health, wealth, reputation, and so on, are relatively unimportant, or they are irrelevant in terms of the fundamental, the ultimate goal of life, which is a kind of moral enlightenment, a kind of wisdom. And from this basic central moral principle, there flow many psychological implications. And in a way, it's kind of obvious that if the Stoics could really embrace this view, that the only thing that truly matters in life is something about our own character. Something internal to us, and the external things are relatively indifferent, that would grant them a quite profound type of emotional, psychological resilience. The ability to cope with loss and misfortune and setbacks in life should flow naturally from embracing these set of values. So this is quite an important thing about Stoicism. It's fundamentally an ethical doctrine, but that ethical doctrine has very obvious psychological implications. And that's how it was perceived in the ancient world. There were many schools of philosophy that were inspired by Socrates, but of them all, Stoicism was the one that had the most obvious psychological implications. So in the ancient world, in Hellenistic philosophy, people talked about Stoicism and talked about philosophy in general as a therapy for the mind. They even use the word therapia later to describe Stoicism and philosophy in general. And then, Stoicism, or the therapeutic dimension of it, in many ways was kind of forgotten, relatively speaking. It was forgotten for a long time, for many, many centuries, for over 1,000 years. And then it kind of became rediscovered, in a sense, or this kind of therapeutic perspective in Stoicism became rediscovered around about the beginning of the 20th century as psychotherapy began to emerge in the modern sense of the word, modern scientific psychotherapy, you could say, or its precursor in the late 19th century, the early 20th century. And the first guy that really got interested in Stoicism was a psychotherapist that everyone has forgotten about now. And his name was Paul Dubois. And he was a Swiss neurologist and a psychiatrist. And he was a big rival of Sigmund Freud in the early 20th century. A very influential guy. There were many people that followed Dubois' teachings. And his approach was called persuasion psychotherapy or rational psychotherapy. And Dubois was really into Seneca. And he used to prescribe reading Seneca to his patients in psychotherapy. I'll read you a quote from one of his books. He says, "If we eliminate from ancient writings a few allusions that give them local colour, we shall find the ideas of Socrates, Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius absolutely modern and applicable to our times. So I love that quote because it's a really clear statement. First of all, the fact that he groups Socrates together with the famous Stoics, but also that he's saying very clearly that he thinks Stoicism is absolutely relevant to modern scientific psychotherapy. And Dubois focused on an aspect of Stoicism which wasn't as much focused on by later generations of psychotherapists. He focused on something that we call today the dichotomy of control. It's this idea that there are some things that are under our control or up to us and other things that aren't, and that being clear about this distinction might be important to develop mental health and emotional resilience. And that was really the main aspect of Stoicism that Dubois focused on with his clients. But also he recognized this idea that many psychological problems are caused by negative self-talk or fixed ideas, as they were known in the language of Victorian psychotherapy, which was compared to a kind of negative autosuggestion or even a kind of negative self-hypnosis. We say stuff that kind of brainwashes us. So I like to compare this to a sort of self-hypnosis or even a kind of rhetoric that we turn on ourselves using language, using verbal thoughts in a way that affects our own emotional state. So we contribute to our anxiety, anger, and depression by the colour of the thoughts that we have, the type of things that we actually say to ourselves. And Dubois saw that in the Stoics, and he emphasised it as an aspect of his therapy. He used Socratic questioning to challenge the validity of some of the automatic thoughts and negative self-talk that his clients were exhibiting. And we find a similar idea in something called the Serenity Prayer, which was popularized by Alcoholics Anonymous. It says, God, give me the serenity to accept the things, God, give me the courage to change the things I can, the serenity to accept the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Maybe I got that the wrong way around, but you get the idea. Pop stars even have that tattooed on them nowadays. So it became a very famous and influential idea associated with Alcoholics Anonymous, but really it captures the essence of this thing we call the dichotomy of control, this idea that we need to clarify the distinction between things that are directly under our control and things that aren't. And the Stoics, the things that are under our control are really our own voluntary thoughts and actions. Epictetus says, in a word, our actions, the stuff that we do. So in a sense, what the Stoics are really doing is trying to parse all of our experience in terms of a clearer distinction between our own actions and everything else, our own actions and our experiences, the stuff that happens to us, or things that befall us in life. Now, everyone forgot about Dubois because he was eclipsed by Sigmund Freud in psychoanalysis. But then the role of Stoicism was rediscovered, the value of Stoicism was rediscovered in the late 1950s by a guy called Albert Ellis, who was one of the pioneers of modern cognitive behavioral therapy. And Ellis in New York developed this thing called rational emotive behavior therapy, or at least that's what it ended up becoming known as, or REBT. It's the first form, or the first major precursor of modern cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. And so Ellis was a psychoanalytic therapist. He became disillusioned with it, and he started looking around for a way of starting again from scratch and building a whole new approach to psychotherapy. And he'd read the Stoics as a teenager. Interestingly, he hadn't read Seneca, or he doesn't refer to Seneca much, who's the Stoic that Dubois was into. Instead, Ellis refers to Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. And he founded his approach to psychotherapy to a large extent on one central idea that he derived from Stoicism, which is passage 5 of a book called the Handbook, or Enchiridion, by Epictetus. And it says, it's not things that upset us, but our opinions about them. And this is of inestimable importance to modern psychotherapy. We even talk about the cognitive revolution in modern psychotherapy. So this is the central premise of Ellis's approach in all cognitive therapy, is the idea that our emotions, to a large extent, are shaped or determined by corresponding underlying beliefs. So a good illustration of that would be that clients come into therapy and they sit down in the consulting room and they tell the therapist that they're really angry, sad, or anxious, and then they'll talk at great length about how this is destroying their relationships, it's affecting them at work, it's affecting their quality of life, so it has all these terrible negative consequences. So the client will tell this story about how awful their experience is as a result of anger, anxiety, depression, and negative emotions they're experiencing. But then they'll usually reach a point where, having highlighted how bad this is, they'll disavow control over it. So usually then they'll say, I know it's wrong, I know it doesn't make sense, I know it's causing all of this harm, the way that I feel, but I can't help it. It's just the way that I feel. And Ellis, at that point in therapy, sometimes would say to his clients, but it's not just the way you feel. It's also the way that you think. Because when people disavow control like that, it kind of draws a line under things. It's like saying, what can I do about it? There's nothing I can do about it. And that's because people tend to think of emotions and thoughts as two separate boxes or two separate categories, an idea that in some ways derives from Plato's theory of the mind. And the Stoics fundamentally disagreed with that. They were way ahead of the time because they said emotions and thoughts aren't separate things. They're overlapping, they're intertwined. And this is the cognitive theory of emotion. It's not just how you feel, it's also how you think. Once we recognize that there are thoughts underlying our feelings, we can identify what those thoughts are, and that raises our awareness, and we can start to challenge how helpful they are, whether they correspond to the evidence, whether they are consistent, or whether they're contradictory, what an alternative or more helpful way of thinking about the same situation would be. In short, as soon as we recognize it's not just how you feel, it's also how you think, it opens up a whole toolbox of cognitive therapy techniques. And the Stoics knew that 2,300 years ago. They were way ahead of the time. Like, we forgot about it, and then it had to be reinvented in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and the cognitive revolution in psychotherapy. And now we have large volumes of evidence that support this way of understanding emotion and this way of working with clients. So we have a course called Stoic Mindfulness and Resilience Training, which is running at the moment, which combines elements of REBT and CBT and other evidence-based approaches to psychotherapy with Stoicism in order to develop emotional resilience. So emotional resilience is like the holy grail of mental health research, because prevention is better than cure. And cognitive therapy is mainly defined as a remedial approach. Clues in the name, it's a therapy. So people have a diagnosis, they've already got a problem. It's a Johnny-come-lately on the scene. And it would be better if we could help people before they have a problem and prevent them from developing one in the future. So prevention is better than cure. But it's proven difficult to develop an effective approach to emotional resilience building. And so our hope is that Stoicism might be sticky, as researchers sometimes say, that when people learn Stoicism, it might make them more resilient, less likely to develop emotional problems in the future, and it may have a lasting or even a permanent psychological effect on them. So our research on Stoic mindfulness and resilience training, we gathered a lot of data using established validated measures that are used in scientific research and psychology in order to be able to make a direct comparison between the effects of Stoicism and the effects of positive psychology or CBT or other mainstream approaches. And we've also done follow-up studies, only at 3 months, but nevertheless to try and see if there should naturally be a wearing off of the benefits of skills training in a therapy or a resilience building approach. One of the big revelations from our research is we didn't really see much evidence of that, which is a very inspiring thing to see. At 3-month follow-up, there was some change, only a small change, in the improvements people experienced from training in Stoicism in terms of positive and negative emotion, but there was barely any difference to the improvements that they've achieved in terms of measures of flourishing or well-being. And so that seemed to be lasting. Stoicism seemed to be sticky. The evidence suggested that the benefits were sticky. So I want to talk a little bit, having spoken about the history of the subject and the research that we're doing, all that kind of jazz. I want to talk a little bit now about some specific techniques that we can do. So the first one, following on from what I said already, we call the dichotomy of control. The ancient Stoics didn't call it that. Making clear this distinction. It's a really odd thing, because Epictetus says some things are up to us and other things are not, which sounds like it's stating the obvious. It sounds like it's just a truism. And yet, like many truisms, it has psychological importance because people forget this and act as if they have control over things that they don't, and they neglect to take responsibility for things that are under their voluntary control. I'll give you an unusual example of that that's close to my heart, and maybe in a sense it's a little bit of a deep dive, so let's go for it. My specialism is treating anxiety in my clinical area, and there are aspects of anxiety, and this also allows me to talk about this more nuanced aspect of the Stoic theory of emotion and the cognitive theory of emotion. So one of the things that really causes problems for people who have severe anxiety in particular, is that anxiety isn't just a homogeneous lump. What we call anxiety consists of a number of factors, and some of them are involuntary or reflex-like. They're not really under direct voluntary control, and other bits of anxiety are under voluntary control. So when we lump it all together, we confuse ourselves about our own emotions, and it prevents us from being able to deal with and to work with them in an intelligent manner, because we oversimplify the nature of emotion in the way that we talk about it. So for instance, if somebody's feeling really anxious, their muscles might be tense, their heart might be beating fast, they might be blushing or sweating. So for instance, if they have social anxiety, so they have these physiological symptoms of anxiety, and people tend to become very preoccupied with those, and they'll try to conceal them from other people because they're ashamed or embarrassed about blushing or sweating or their hands shaking. And they'll also try and kind of force them out of awareness, try to relax, try to counter them in various ways. They'll grip onto things to stop their hands shaking, and they'll struggle. They'll engage in a kind of struggle, an internal battle with these involuntary aspects of our emotional response. And that is quite toxic. Like, it has a number of negative effects. Overloads our brains. So if someone's trying to do that and engage in public speaking at the same time, it's going to be hard for them to concentrate. Increases the cognitive load. It also forces us to allocate much more attention than normal to the symptoms of anxiety, putting them under a magnifying glass that tends to perpetuate and amplify them. So it's a really circular, unhealthy way of responding to anxiety. And at the same time, people tend to underestimate how much control they have over the genuinely voluntary aspects of anxiety. So that's more what happens next, how we respond to those feelings. So for example, many people who suffer from anxiety worry about things. They continue thinking about them afterwards, and they have high-level strategic cognition, so that takes place over time. So it's not like boom, and something that washes over them immediately like a reflex, but it's a process they engage in. And so people will often say that their worry is uncontrollable. This is a very common thing for anxious clients to say. But in fact, all the research on worry suggests that worry is voluntary to a large extent. The initial thoughts that pop into our mind and feelings that trigger worry might be automatic or involuntary, but what happens next is largely under conscious voluntary control. And I'll give you some interesting examples of that. But it's this confusion of what's up to us and what isn't that lies at the heart of many anxiety disorders, basically. A good example would be what we call generalized anxiety disorder, or pathological worrying is permeated by this kind of confusion. People trying too hard to control the involuntary aspects of their emotion and neglecting to take responsibility for the voluntary aspects of their emotion. And sometimes what we'll do is focus on radical acceptance of the feelings, cultivating an attitude of acceptance and indifference towards them, while training clients to learn how to take more control over the voluntary aspects of anxiety, the process of worrying that they engage in. So when people worry, they typically engage in what we call what-if thinking. What if what happens? What if that happens? What if the sky falls in on me? So hypothetical catastrophes, and they'll ask unanswerable questions. What if this happens? How will I cope? It's a cliched pattern that worry takes, but that can go on for hours with some people, and it can prevent them from sleeping at night. Whereas other people might just interrupt that process of thinking and say, why am I even wasting my time doing this? So some people need to learn the skill to be able to step out of the cycle of worry and take more voluntary control over it. So that a little bit about the dichotomy of control. And central to this, I mentioned also this idea, it's not things that upset us, but our opinions about them. Realizing that we call cognitive distancing. So cognitive distancing, I believe, is actually the most important psychological concept and process at the heart of Stoicism. It's central to cognitive therapy. There's a lot of research on it, especially over the last 10 or 15 years. But it's the beautiful thing about it is that it's a simple maneuver. It's a fairly simple thing. It has quite generic benefits. But you might think, well, if it's that easy and it's that good, how come everyone's not doing it already? And the answer is because we don't really have a good way of describing it. It's a subtle concept that takes a little bit of patience to describe. And some people get the idea immediately, and then other people kind of struggle a little bit to understand what's meant by this. So the way that we usually explain cognitive distancing is to say, look, when you think something's awful or catastrophic, say you lose your job or your girlfriend dumps you or something like that, boyfriend dumps you, you might think, oh, this is terrible, it's catastrophic. The catastrophicness of it, we talk about as if it's a physical property, like something being black or white or big or small, hot or cold. It's catastrophic. And cognitive distancing consists in realizing that the belief that it's catastrophic comes from inside me. It's being projected onto external events. It doesn't reside in external reality, but rather that's something that I'm imposing or projecting onto external events. So the distancing occurs in separating that value judgment from the external event, realizing that the opposite would be to talk about these two things being fused together. Marcus Aurelius talks about our thoughts and external reality being mingled or blended together, and we need to prise them apart, separate them, and realize that they're actually two different things. And this relates to dichotomy of control, because these thoughts are that we potentially have voluntary control over, whereas the external events are things that happen to us. They're not directly under our voluntary control. So how do we gain cognitive distance? That Socrates, from whom the Stoics derive this concept, had a typical strategy that we can see him using. He'll typically say to people, do other people feel the same way about the situation? For example, in Xenophon's Memorabilia, Socrates is talking to one of his buddies, a guy called Chirocrates, who's the younger brother of one of Socrates' best friends, a guy called Chaerephon. Who's actually the guy that went to the oracle at Delphi and asked it about Socrates. He's part of the mythos, part of the legend of Socrates. So this dude's brother comes to Socrates and says, I can't stand my big brother. Socrates gets involved in a lot of these kind of family squabbles. And one of the questions he asks him is, does everybody feel the same way about him? And incidentally, it's kind of self-referential, because Socrates doesn't feel that way about Chaerephon. He could have said, oh, well, I guess you don't, right? There are other perspectives are available. And realizing, again, this is such a simple move, but realizing that other people feel and look at a situation differently helps us to gain cognitive distance. Because if I think someone's an idiot, I think they're unbearable, or some event is catastrophic, but I can imagine that someone else might potentially see it differently, that forces me to separate my value judgments from the external event, to gain separation between them, realize maybe this is just one of several perspectives. The way that Aaron Beck, who came a bit later than Ellis, is one of who is the founder of cognitive therapy, one of the pioneers of CBT. So Ellis and Beck, the two main pioneers of CBT, not the only ones, but the two main ones. Beck used to explain cognitive distancing. He introduced this term, by the way, to his clients as follows. He would say, imagine you're wearing coloured glasses, and you're going around with them on. I'll do my glasses. So you're going around with these glasses on, and they're, say they're kind of sad and blue glasses, and you just think, wow, the world is really sad and blue. It just is awful sad and blue. And then one day you bump into someone else who's looking at the world through rose-tinted glasses. And you suddenly realize, oh, I can take these glasses off and I could put the rose-tinted ones on. And you realize that the blueness isn't a property of the external world. It's a property of the lens through which you're looking at it. In the same way that someone being a bitch or an idiot or a bastard or, excuse my language, therapy language, or something being a complete disaster, a catastrophe. These are lenses through which people, clients in therapy, or all of us, look at external events. And fusion, a problem occurs when we start to feel as if that's the only way of understanding an event. And cognitive flexibility occurs when we start to realize there might be other perspectives available. And when we realize that realization alone tends to dilute our emotional response. It gains us mental, psychological flexibility, creativity, it lessens the impact of strong emotions, and it improves our ability to cope with with stressful situations. It's fundamental to emotional resilience in general. And there are many other things that go along with it, but it's really the centerpiece of Stoicism. One way that we train that in SMRT is actually using a technique that it's an odd technique. There's pros and cons to doing it, but it's kind of a cool technique. It's not for everyone. But we call it the leaves in the stream exercise, and it comes from a modern variation, a form of what we call third wave CBT, called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. So the way we do it is we get clients to visualize a river, and then just to notice when they have intrusive thoughts that pop into the mind, what we call automatic thoughts. So they might, and typically those thoughts are about the exercise. So the client will be sitting there going, this is a stupid exercise, why am I wasting my time on it? And then we'll ask them to imagine that they're writing that thought on a piece of paper. There are many ways to cognitive distance, but a lot of them involve imagining the thought being written down. So we get them to imagine writing that thought on a bit of paper, this is a stupid exercise, and then putting it on a leaf, placing that leaf on the river. So now we're objectifying the thought, we've turned it into something written, we're picturing it from a distance, and then just kind of, in a very relaxed and patient way, imagining it naturally flowing down the river until it disappears off into the horizon. So we have to walk a very thin line between actively trying to suppress thoughts, like push them out of our mind, and just letting go of them and allowing them to fade away naturally without fusing them with reality. So we have to learn, first of all, to view them objectively, as if we're looking at someone else's thoughts, and then to let go of them, allow them to pass from the mind, rather than chewing over them, ruminating about them, or worrying about them, perpetuating them for a long time. That's what the Stoics want us to avoid. That's, in a sense, what the Stoics mean by passion, is this kind of perseverative, ruminative style of thinking, where we fuse thoughts with reality that involve strong value judgments, and we kind of perpetuate them. And a kind of corollary of this, I wanted to talk about a few different things, so I'll speed through them a little bit, is something that the Stoics call, it's related to a concept that in Stoicism is called phantasia cataleptica, which is a hard Greek expression, not only to say, but also to translate. It means a way of looking at things, a representation of things that firmly grasps objective reality. And it's associated in Stoicism with describing events in a down-to-earth, objective manner, free from rhetoric, like the sophists might use. So Stoicism is the opposite of sophistry. The sophists want to manipulate people's emotions by using colourful metaphors and powerful emotive language. And the Stoics want to do a kind of anti-rhetoric or counter-rhetoric in a sense. This is why Cicero had mixed feelings about Stoicism. He was very uncomfortable with the Stoic concept of rhetoric. He thought it was ineffective in the law court. So the Stoics, you'll see many examples of this. Marcus Aurelius, for example, says when you're looking at a banquet as Roman emperor, he says, this is a dead pig. This is just fermented grape juice. So describing things in terms of natural properties in a more banal, kind of down-to-earth way, but really in an objective way that suspends emotive rhetoric and strong value judgments. Epictetus puts it very concisely. He says to his students, by all means say that someone has been sent to prison, but just don't add alas, don't add it's awful to it. So don't just describe the facts without adding the strong value judgment on top of it. And it's okay to say, I'd prefer that he didn't go to prison, but don't say, and it's catastrophic, and fuse the value judgment with reality. That's a recipe for neurosis, the Stoics might have said. That's where problems tend to begin. One of my favourite quotes I've discovered recently is Crates, the Cynic philosopher, said to Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, and it's beautifully concise in Greek. He says, nothing terrible has befallen you, and nothing catastrophic has happened to you. Because in nature, there is nothing catastrophic. There's just changes in physical substances. And nature just changes. It doesn't know whether something's been created or destroyed or whether it's good or bad. It's free from value judgments. Right? So Zeno had this lentil soup splashed all over him, which is terribly embarrassing in public, in the Keramakos in Athens. And he ran away, kind of feeling really embarrassed and stuff. And his teacher Crates said, why do you run away? Nothing catastrophic has happened to you. You know, the catastrophic part is all coming from inside your mind. Like, what the thing that happened to you is neither good nor bad, it's indifferent. There's a kind of related Stoic technique which is similar to stuff we use in therapy. We can see it mentioned a few times and Marcus Aurelius. I mention it because Baudouin, one of the followers of Dubois, puts a lot of emphasis on it. He gives it a name, which is quite cool. He calls it depreciation by analysis. And it's this idea that you find in Marcus of taking things one step at a time and breaking them into parts. So Marcus says you can be swept away by the emotional beauty of a piece of music or a dance. But if you think of it as one small step at a time, then it kind of loses its spell over the mind. Now we know that that leads to a sort of cognitive distancing or diffusion. Like if you're listening to a horror story, sitting around a campfire, a ghost story, it might make you shudder, like if you get really lost in the story. But if you kind of pick it apart and you're just listening to one word at a time and focusing on one little aspect and not really in the whole picture, it will ruin the effect of the narrative. It will ruin the self-hypnosis of it. It doesn't have the same kind of emotive effect. So Marcus talks about ruining a piece of music like that. Think of worry as a kind of tragic song that has this emotional effect on your mind, or like worry like a horror story that you tell yourself. And if you pick it apart and focus on one little bit at a time, it tends to destroy the overall effect. It leads to a kind of cognitive distancing that separates. So it makes the thought seem kind of arbitrary. Oh my, this is catastrophic. How will I cope? Oh, these are just things I'm telling. Those are just words, right? Just stuff I'm telling myself. You know, someone else might come along and view the same situation in a different way. 10 years from now, I might view the same situation in a very different way. And that often happens with, the truth is that very often happens with people losing their job or relationship breakups. It seems catastrophic at the time. You break up with your girlfriend when you're, 17 or whatever, boohoo, it seems like the biggest tragedy that's ever happened. 40 years later, when you're looking back on it, it doesn't really seem like that big a deal because you've had lots of other relationships since. It no longer seems like the end of the world that it was when you were 17. Likewise, when people lose their jobs, it often seems like a really big deal at the time, and maybe it is very difficult for some, several weeks or whatever. But looking back on the job that you lost when you were in your early 20s, if your life has moved on, it doesn't seem like that big a deal. There's maybe a few weeks of inconvenience, and perhaps you found a better job, or you started a business or something like that, and your life moved on. So the perspective that we have and the value judgments that we have will change over time, but also other people. Epictetus, when he says it's not things that upset us, but opinions about them, the very next sentence, I wish people would quote more often, because he says, for example, and he picks the most extreme example he can think of. Epictetus is not the most subtle philosopher. He'll just kind of go straight for the jugular. He said, for example, death. The death in itself isn't intrinsically catastrophic or awful, because if it was, then, for instance, Socrates would have thought that it was terrible, and he didn't. He was resigned to his death, and he embraced it with dignity. And so it's interesting he uses Socrates as an example, because this idea is not things that upset us, but opinions about them, definitely is attributed to Socrates, not just in Plato, but also in Xenophon. So I think the Stoics self-consciously derived it from Socrates, but others may disagree with that. So I wanted to mention, I'll open things up for discussion in a few minutes. I want to mention maybe just one other technique that's kind of related to the cognitive distancing and stuff, and that's one of my favorite techniques in psychotherapy, which is a behavioral technique, or a cognitive behavioral technique called worry postponement. And there are a number of versions of this. It's also good in similar things, good in anger management. But I'll start off by talking about a research study. In the 1980s, the leading researcher on worry, a guy called Tom Borkovic, a psychologist in the States, did a study with a bunch of college students where they were asked to notice when they began to worry about something. And then to write down the thing they were worrying about on a piece of paper, which encourages cognitive distance. I can't believe, how am I ever going to make a living? I could go on forever, that conversation, right? But worrying about what I'm going to do after I graduate might just be like a sentence, very brief, learn about paper, fold it up, stick it in your pocket. Think, I'm going to come back and think about that later. I'll worry about that at 7 o'clock tonight. So setting a prescribed worry time. You can even have a special worry chair and a funny little worry hat if you want. You can have a corner of the room especially set aside for worrying. But a prescribed situation. It's called the stimulus control method of worrying. And he told the students to do that. And the outcome was that there was roughly a 50% reduction after, I think it was a week or 2 weeks, in the frequency, intensity, and duration of worry episodes. So it had a very profound effect. And that technique is incorporated into many different modern CBT protocols. It's probably one of the most common techniques that's used across the board for different forms of generalized anxiety disorder. And so again, it's about realizing that we have voluntary control over things. So we don't have voluntary control over the initial thought that pops into the mind. The Stoics would say the propatheia, like the initial feeling, the incipient feeling. We don't have control of that. And it could be because someone else says, have you thought about what you're going to do when you graduate? And they put the idea in our mind. Sometimes it may be an external trigger, maybe something that comes on the radio, or it might just be a kind of spontaneous thing that randomly pops into our mind. We might be drifting to sleep and it's like we're starting to dream and suddenly a distressing trigger pops into our mind. But we don't have to respond to it. It would be natural when you're falling asleep to think, I'll think about that tomorrow. I'm trying to get to sleep right now. That's a normal, healthy, natural way of responding to intrusive thoughts when you're engaged in some other activity. If you're looking after kids and they're taking all of your attention and you suddenly think, what am I going to do about some relationship problem, or suddenly realize I haven't paid the bill, like in order to do childcare and look after a small child, for instance, you might have to think, I need to come back and think about that later. It's not the right time to think about it right now. So exerting voluntary control over our voluntary processes of thinking. So not trying to fight the initial thought or suppress it, but just going, like, that's interesting. I noticed that thought's popped into my mind. I'll come back to it later. Epictetus tells his students to say to the thoughts, you're just an impression and not at all the thing you claim to represent. So separating the impression from external reality. And then he tells his students to say, set it aside and come back to it later. And that's sound advice in many situations because we go into a different mode of functioning psychologically when we're angry or depressed or anxious, and where we find it harder to reason. So if we delay responding, often we'll then have calmed down and we're more able to think in a rational, balanced, clear, problem-solving manner. And just exerting that voluntary control kind of also tricks your mind into gaining cognitive distance. So you might notice those thoughts and say, I'm not going to let that hijack my thinking right now. You know, I'm not going to let other people, the radio, just kind of random thoughts tell me what I should be thinking about right now. So there's a kind of maturity and a self-possessedness, a self-control, mindfulness that comes from being able to spot these intrusive thoughts or external triggers and go, if I think about that, I'll be the one that chooses when I think about it. It's not the right time now, I'll come back to it later. And we know now from more recent research that Berkovic told his students to sit down at the worry time and think things through more rationally. There's other stuff that they could do during worry time, but we now know one of the simplest, most powerful things is just to say, do you still think it's worth dealing with this thought, or does it no longer seem important? And roughly half the time or more, people will say, it doesn't seem important anymore, which just highlights to them, the error involved in allowing automatic thoughts to hijack their attention for what might be hours. When, if they return to it later, they might think, it's not worth it. It doesn't really seem like a big deal anymore to me somehow, because I'm no longer in an anxious mode of functioning, so I have a different perspective on it. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that kind of lightning tour of some Stoic and CBT techniques that we could use today for therapy to contribute to building emotional resilience. We use some of these techniques in Stoic mindfulness and resilience training, the online course that we run that's going at the moment. And having done that, I'll see if I can now open it up to questions.
I have a question about complexity of issues. Often issues are very, very complex, and it's hard to distinguish between the things that are under your control and aren't under your control. For instance, what if something is out of your control, but someone else thinks it's in your control, and there are big consequences if you don't solve this?
And the Stoic response to that is very simple. As a therapist, what I often find is that when people can be stalled, complexity is a problem, right? And so either we deal with complexity by breaking things down, or often we introduce a different perspective from which the complexity is just dissolved. It doesn't seem complex anymore. The Stoic answer to this is actually very simple. And I mentioned it earlier. Epictetus says there's only one thing that's under your control, really, or one category of thing, and that's your own actions. So this debate doesn't really exist for Epictetus. You'll notice he doesn't really get into that argument about, something's partially under your control or which things. He's not talking about any external things about which there could be disagreement. He's saying what's under your control are your own actions. And how do you know if it's under your control or not? Again, this kind of relates to the example I gave of worry postponement. There's a really easy way you can tell whether something's under voluntary control or not, and that is stop doing it. If you can stop doing it, then it's under voluntary control. And so we have this discussion in therapy, and we'll say to clients, could you stop doing it then? If you can just stop, then it's under voluntary control. Could you do it, stop doing it, start again? We call that an A-B test, right? And it's actually really simple to do. So I would say in some ways that confusion is a bit of a red herring, because normally we can get past it pretty quickly in the beginning of a therapy session and reorient the client towards focusing on the voluntary thoughts that they have and how they're contributing to the problem.
Hi, thank you for really interesting talk and really well explained. Very good. So my question is mainly about the kind of second part with cognitive distancing. Especially I think the analogy you've got with kind of wearing glasses that might make you feel a certain way and then realizing that you can actually take off these glasses. I think it's a really nice story, a really nice analogy, and it's obviously really important, especially in the history of philosophy. It's something that's been used a lot to talk about, what's actually out there and what's just a result of your interaction with the world. But the question in this case for me is, but is it true? Because whilst value judgment might not be objective, there is something about, if someone has had truly terrible things happen to them, say they've, really lost a loved one at a young age and whatnot, it can be whatever it is, right? There's something about, I imagine as a therapist, if someone comes to you with some kind of serious, something genuinely awful, I suppose you don't say, oh, but it's just the way you look at it, right? There's something about it that if something bad has happened to you, everyone would say, yeah, that's actually really awful. Everyone would even agree that it is. So even if it's true that in some other cosmic sense, nothing is good and nothing is bad, things just are, in a different sense, many people could agree that if you lost both your parents at an early age and this caused you to go to some bad other family, that, that's bad, right? It's not enough to say, oh, well,
Well, I disagree. So I'm going to actually dispute that. Okay. But we'd have to be careful about how we, so I think there are different ways that people could look, these kind of situations that you're talking about that most people might agree are bad. They may even say that they're catastrophic. The point that the Stoics are making, the Stoics might say, look, it may be that in a sense you're right, that the majority of people might arrive at a consensus that this is a bad event, it's a terrible event, even if it's a catastrophic event. But that still doesn't mean that the catastrophicness of it inheres in the external situation. It just means that everybody's in agreement that they view it that way, that they hold those values about it, that it's something that they would rather didn't happen. That's different from saying that the value actually inheres in the event itself. And despite that, you can still imagine situations where somebody might view the event differently. People might assign different degrees of negative value judgment to it, or what somebody sees as catastrophic when they think of their life as a whole, and they place it within a broader context, it might change the significance or the value of it. So there isn't only one way of thinking, even about these events regarding which there appears to be a kind of social consensus. But the key point is that the awfulness of it doesn't actually reside in the external event itself. At best, it's something that a lot of people agree to view in an averse manner.
Can I quickly respond to that?
Sure. Yeah.
So okay, fair enough. That makes sense, and I can agree with that. That you can, if you really want to push it, it doesn't reside in the. It's not. I do really want to push it. Yeah, but even so, that's maybe not the question. The question I would say is, but is it helpful to tell someone if you have had a loved one die and you tell them, oh well, it's just about the way you look at things? How is that helpful? Maybe then that's the question I want to ask.
okay, so that would be a tactless thing to say, right?
Yeah.
And although there may be, nevertheless, in a sense, like there's clearly some truth about that, right? And it's clearly true that, you know, everybody at some point loses a loved one, or almost everybody does, but people view it differently and cope with it differently, respond to it differently, and they have done in different cultures, like, and periods in history, like people have responded, felt about these things differently, and coped with them differently. So it would nevertheless be tactless and intrusive to say to somebody that would appear dismissive. And the Stoics are sensitive to that. Like Epictetus says to his students, you know, you shouldn't just kind of crash into somebody's grief and mourning and tell them like that they're, you know, it's not things that upset us, it's just the way that we just our opinions about them. Even though we might believe that, we might think in a sense it's self-evidently true, it'd be tactless and inappropriate to say that. And that historically, I think this is one of the differences between the Stoics and their predecessors, the Cynics. The Cynics were a little bit more brutal in their plain speaking, as they called it, the parrhesia. And the Stoics want to accommodate other people's emotions a little bit more, and they want to speak honestly to people and challenge their views, but they also believe that this has to be done tactfully enough that the other person is going to be willing to listen.
Right. I think most people are interested in self-reflection, but most people come in contact with it in a certain part of their life and at a different age, different circumstances. And some of the things like cognitive distancing are very helpful. But do you think it's something we can teach like children at an earlier age to incorporate in their lives, instead of them waiting to hit a wall and then go looking for something that can help them?
I mean, it's an interesting, there may be research on this actually. I've never really dug into that. I'd be surprised if somebody hasn't tried at some point to find out, you know, difference between different developmental stages and the ability to gain cognitive distance. But relatively young children can definitely be taught that skill. And in cognitive therapy, we normally dispute the content of the client's thought. So the client might say, nobody likes me, everybody hates me, I think I'll go and eat worms. And the therapist will say, well, what evidence is there that nobody likes you, everybody hates you? Have you tested this out? Have you gathered evidence to substantiate it? Are there things that might contradict it? And the risk is you kind of get lost in the weeds a little bit, especially if you're working with a group of people and you're beginning to kind of question individual thoughts. It's really, that very quickly you can get lost in the minutiae. It's easier and it's more generic just to train people to gain cognitive distance, whatever their thoughts are, basically. And so I think it's potentially an easier skill to teach to younger kids as well. But it's not really my area of specialism. I'm an adult therapist. It's not something I've worked with a lot. I used to work with 15-year-olds. They seem perfectly capable of doing it. And I have a 9-year-old daughter, and she seems to be kind of like wrestling with the concept a little bit. It's a bit abstract for her, but like, you know, she's able to kind of discuss it with me. So thanks for inviting me along, and I hope
Thank you a lot for coming and joining us. And then, we'll leave you go to your next meeting.
And I say hello to Massimo. Hi, Massimo, and good luck with your presentation. I'm sure you'll enjoy what Massimo has to say as well. Okay, cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.
Cheers, bye-bye. All right.